He wanted to grow 2.8. He says he will end at 1.5. Non-oil GDP, he wanted 3%. He says he will end at 1.5. Inflation, his target was 18. He will end at 31%. Primary balance, he wanted a positive primary balance of 0.5. He will end with a negative primary balance of 0.7. Wow. Gross reserves, and I wish the deputy minister was here. She's here. Madam, we are talking of gross reserves. We are not talking of net reserves. And in your document, you stated gross reserves. This oil, if you take President Akufo-Addo in 2022, they made a loss of 60 billion cedis. From a profit of almost 1 billion, with this minimal amount of oil revenue, we made a profit of over 1 billion. And yet with all these resources, under President Akufo-Addo, the Bank of Ghana has made a loss of 60 billion. Now the Bank of Ghana is not a profit-making entity. The Bank of Ghana is a regulator and a banker of a last resort, a banker of the government, and then, most importantly, even when they make profit, they have to transfer it to the consolidated fund. Mr. Speaker, look at equity, and that for me is the most important part. Under President Mahama, we had a positive equity of 4 billion. The equity is what, like, shareholders contribute. So when there's profit, you transfer to the shareholder in the form of transfer, which is equity. Mr. Speaker, today, the equity of the Bank of Ghana is negative 55 billion. Wow. Look, we've never witnessed this. Wow. And I think that this chamber, I'm putting politics aside on this call, this chamber should take an interest in investigating how come the central bank makes a loss of 55 billion in terms of equity.
Well, so that was what happened in Parliament, both the budget and this issue of the Bank of Ghana. And let me welcome Dr. Theo Acheampong. He is the political risk analyst and economist as well. Dr. Theo Acheampong, thank you for joining us. Good morning.
Good morning.
Also, Professor Godfred Bokwe will be joining us shortly. But the Bank of Ghana has been responding to the 60 billion cedis loss that they posted at the end of 2022. They say it's all because of the Domestic Debt Exchange Program, DDEP. That's why they lost this much money. This is the Director of Research addressed the press earlier in the week. Take a look.
In a one-time hit for almost everything, and we don't expect anything else to impact our balance sheet. The marketable instruments, the non-marketable instruments, and then cocoa board. These three items accounted for about 53.1 billion of the losses that we made. Out of that 60 loss, these three items alone is 53. It's about 90% of the loss is coming from domestic debt exchange. Will we have a domestic debt exchange impacting on our balance sheet next year? Emphatic no. It's not happening again.
Okay. Well, so that's the Bank of Ghana there. And again, let me pick a big. Is it just as simple as that? You know what? It's 60 billion we've lost. It's because of DDEP and not about recklessness. And that had it not been that's the Bank of Ghana, also investing in the cocoa board and also government instruments, they wouldn't have lost this much. So it's just DDEP. So they said they don't want to be blamed for that or to be held responsible for it. We should be asking questions of the Domestic Debt Exchange Program. Is it that simple?
Alfred, let me tell you bluntly that what you're saying is not true.
It's not true?
Absolutely not. If you understand basic accounting, you will be able to work this out and not actually with numbers. Martin is the one who does or represent bondholders. Okay. I'm the central bank. Okay, you are the government. So the central bank is the bank of the government. If government wants to issue bonds, the government will do that through the central bank. The central bank will issue it on behalf of the government. Obviously, get the money and give it to the government to use it for whatever purpose the government needs the money for. So, Martin buys a bond. I am the custodian of the bond for the central bank, for the government.
Mm-hmm.
The government decides to give the bond Martin is holding 50% haircut. You know what that means? It means that the government of Ghana is actually reducing his payable by 50% to Martin. The money that should have been paid to Martin will be 50% less. If there's a 50% less of the money the government is who is taking the hit here? It's Martin, not the central bank.
Right.
So how does the central bank, apart from operational costs, loses such colossal amount of money when basically the liability is not on the central bank, but it's on to every account, and I'm saying that's basic account. There is asset and there's liability, okay? If somebody is carrying the asset, somebody is carrying the liability. If the money that the government would have paid to Martin, the bond holder, would have been reduced by 50%, so that will move to the asset side of the government balance sheet, in this case, the central bank. How does it then become a liability? The liability is sitting with Martin. But there is an operational cost in all this DDEP. That will not amount to the amount of money they are talking about.
The 60 billion cedis.
It is purely printing money for government to use. It cannot. Look, let me give you. The Bank of Ghana gets revenue in many ways. Let me just give you a quick. Look, this issue is going to be a serious issue. Bank of Ghana, let me just be very, very quick with this. You get money, the government gets money from export revenue, which is the gold, the oil, the cocoa that we sent out. That money, when it comes in, the revenue, the hard currency, it sits with the Bank of Ghana. Right. This is what goes into the reserve. You have tax revenue that the GRA collects for government, that also goes to the Bank of Ghana. Every cash goes to the Bank of Ghana. It doesn't. That's the only place government keeps its money in various accounts. There are grants and other things. These are all budgetary figures that also gets to them. Then you have, there are two balance sheets at the Bank of Ghana, or you can look at Bank of Ghana in two different balance sheets. One balance sheet is a mirror of the budget, because all the revenue streams that comes into the budget goes to Bank of Ghana. All the expenditure side is money that is drawn down from Bank of Ghana. So Bank of Ghana should be able to give you a balance sheet of government, i.e. the budget. The deficit in the budget is the money that they will go and borrow. So your domestic bond, your euro bonds are to plug in the hole for that deficit. So basically, the deficit that a bank should get, or the government should get, should be the deficit in nominal terms. That is the actual cash.
Yes.
There are other activities, like the cocoa syndication. If it doesn't, obviously when that money comes in, it also goes to the central bank.
They talked about exposure to cocoa board.
Yes, you borrow 1.5 billion from the international market, because cocoa board has a credibility in terms of in terms of managing this cocoa, because when they get the money, they pay. Okay? Usually they don't get the amount they're looking for. So of course, if there's a shortage, Bank of Ghana will have to step in. So supposing on the cocoa board side, the syndication, there was a shortage or whatever, then they step in. Let me tell you the other ways that the banks also make money. The Bank of Ghana has an offshore reserves with corresponding banks. It also has investment in offshore instruments. We also had a fund. The Heritage Fund, if you remember. Heritage Fund is managed by Bank of Ghana for the Ministry of Finance. But this fund does not sit in this country. It sits somewhere in New York and invests in offshore. So these are all places that Bank of Ghana makes money. So when you look at the Bank of Ghana itself, its own balance sheet, you'll be looking at the profit that it makes from these kind of transactions, and also printing of money. When you print money, those who print the money, there is a cost for printing money, the paper and the security features. So suppose you want to print a $100 note, a 100 CD note. That 100 CD note could cost 20 CDs to print it. But the face value of the paper, once it's printed, is 100 cedis. Therefore, if you give it to a bank, a commercial bank, being central bank being the bank of last resort, commercial bank needs money. It lends that money to commercial bank on its face value, which is so they expect 100. So in that case, the bank has made a profit of about 80 cedis, which is called a seigniorage, and that becomes a profit of the bank. So you have certain activities that gives the bank's profit, and there are certain activities that is also a liability. For instance, interest rate movement. Anytime that the economy is overheating, and you have to apply tighten interest rate and all that, obviously by taking out money from the system, you are paying for that money you are taking out of the system, and you are also paying interest on the instrument with which you are taking money. So that becomes a liability. These are the things that when they come together in the end, should give you the proper picture of the balance sheet of Bank of Ghana itself. When it becomes a profit, don't forget that Bank of Ghana is 100% owned by the Republic of Ghana.
Okay.
So any profit that comes to Bank of Ghana is a profit shared. There's a distribution method of sharing it between Bank of Ghana and the government. If there's a liability, if you are running a company, if there are profits, who takes the profit? Shareholders. If there's a liability, who takes it? Shareholders. So why is it that now we are at a point where we don't know who this $60 billion? This is a debt that should be passed to the bank, should be passed to the government of Ghana. There's a similar incident recently in the UK, where the Central Bank of UK incurred a debt of 150 billion as a result of all this COVID and all these things going on. That money has now been passed on to the central government of the United Kingdom.
Holding on to that point, because Dr. Tue Champong, one of the references that the Bank of Ghana has made in their defense throughout the week is that, well, other central banks are making losses, and they make reference to the Bank of England. Can they take solace in what's happening in the Bank of England, this £150 billion that the Bank of England has posted? Is it the same circumstance that led to this 60 billion cedis loss and the explanation that they've given?
Good morning. First point is all central banks try to do a similar thing. The first thing is price stability, basically trying to manage inflation. And then the second thing is to support the general economic policy of government. And so they might borrow money or lend money to the government. They might print money. They might do other things related to that. But not all central banks are the same when it comes to the muscle and the firepower that they have. In the case of the Bank of England, they talk about the quantitative easing and some of the COVID-related monies that they had to pump in to support the government back then. In Ghana's case, there is something similar at play. But again, I think the substance requires us to interrogate it a little bit much more deeper than that. So I would want to take us first to the Bank of Ghana's own mandate as defined in Act 612. And Act 612 was actually amended by Act 918 in 2016. And if you look at the objects of the Bank of Ghana, the first thing in Section 3.1 says that the primary objective of the Bank of Ghana is to maintain stability in the general level of prices. So that's inflation, dealing with that. Then it says in the amendment that the principal amendment is so without limiting subsection 1, which is to do with the price stability, the bank shall support general economic policy of the government, promote economic growth, and contribute to the promotion and maintenance of the financial well-being in the country. And then it talks further about the independence of the central bank. So the question really at the end of the day is, if you assess the performance of the central bank on these two core mandates The first one, which is to do with inflation, in my case, it scores 0 in my books, and I'll explain why that is the case. And you see why that is actually linked to the second objective of supporting the economy, where they printed money and lent money to the government, even beyond the amounts that were agreed in the budget. So again, it's quite important that we appreciate these things. So I would want us to go back to the mid-year budget, and there's a table in the mid-year budget, table 6, where they provide a summary of the financing operations for last year, 2022. And it's very interesting in that table 6, because what you've got is a couple of columns there. The first column that is of interest for the purposes of this discussion is the budget. So when the budget was read in November of 2021, so this is the 2022 budget, the government said that they're going to be having a deficit of 37 billion Ghana cedis. Out of this 37 billion, about 28 billion was going to come from domestic financing and 4.5 billion from foreign financing. So again, keep that in mind. Within that 28 billion, right, there was 0 line in there being allocated to the Bank of Ghana. So most of the domestic financing was going to come through commercial banks and other non-banks. So basically government selling treasury bills and all these other instruments to take money from us in return for paying us something. Then in the mid-year budget, when the government came, the financing or the deficit moved slightly to 38.9 billion. So from 37 to 38.9 billion. And out of this 38.9 billion, again, the domestic financing was 28 billion. And suddenly the Bank of Ghana, which in the original budget had 0 allocation for domestic financing, it moves to 8 billion. And you still have the commercial banks and the non-banks being like the major player in financing the deficit. Then something interesting happens, which is what I think is very important. So Russia, Ukraine, and all of that happened. The mid-year budget is presented, and then from July of last year, we start getting all of the challenges and the issues with the economy and the run on the cedi and related matters coming into August and September. So at the end of the year, when these numbers are then reconciled, which is what this mid-year budget, the minister came to Parliament to present, the financing of the deficit now moves from the 38.9 billion to 65 billion. So almost twice the amount that originally the government came in the mid-year to tell us they'll be spending. But something remarkable happens. The domestic financing bit of that also now moves from 28 to 55.5 billion. And out of this 55.5 billion, as much as 53 billion comes from the Bank of Ghana, right?
Wow.
So you begin to see what is happening. Over 85% of the actual financing of the deficit. So if you take every 100 Ghana cedis, 85 cedis out of that
is coming from the Bank of Ghana.
From the Bank of Ghana to finance the deficit. And it's not or has nothing to do with the domestic debt exchange or any of the other reasons that they're talking about. You know, that plays a role. But if you look at it from the financing side of the equation, it is not all down to the debt exchange. It's really fundamentally down to the government relying and using the central bank, in my words, as a piggy bank to finance the deficit, beyond even the appropriations and the amount that they themselves came to Parliament to tell us that they'll be spending in July. So that 55 billion, 53 comes from Bank of Ghana, and then only 2.7 billion comes from the commercial banks, and then a few other with the non-bank. Because at the time, there was a lot of volatility and a lot of issues with the economy, and people were a bit reticent in terms of lending to Ghana, with the CDN, all of the things in there. That, I think, is the core point that needs to be made, really, in this argument, because if you now square the circle between the two objectives that I highlighted, this financing, this 53 billion out of 55 billion of domestic financing that the Bank of Ghana was pumping in, actually ended up driving some of the inflation that we've seen in the country, right? So you see the inconsistency. In one sense, the primary objective is that the bank has to fight inflation, and that's very clearly spelled out in their object 3.1 of Act 612 as amended. But in another sense, they were printing and giving a lot of money to the government beyond even the allocated amounts in the budget. And that is what has led us down this hole where they are reporting major losses for their accounts. The domestic debt exchange doesn't take place until this year. We're only talking beginning of this year. It was concluded in February, although it was announced back in back in December of last year. So I think it's not all down to the debt exchange. There's another dimension, which is the Bank of Ghana's own operational expenses, which we need to also touch on. If you look at, again, the annual report that they issued, if you look at the operational expenses, and there's a table there, table 6, in that, you see, for example, foreign and domestic travel costs. In 2021, this was 28 million Ghana cedis. In 2022, this jumps by almost threefold to 97 million Ghana cedis. And I think some explanations have to be given to Ghanaians as to why that was the case. You can see the same thing, motor vehicle maintenance and running costs. That jumps from 61 million in 2021 to 131.58 million in 2022.
In fact, on that point, the Bank of Ghana this week, when they addressed the press, went to ask that question, my colleagues who were there, and they said that their response was that they run a large fleet of vehicles, so they have to move money, from Accra to all the other 16 regions. They also are subject to the price fluctuations in fuel prices, and so all of that contributed to the jump to 131 million of their running cost.
That cannot account for banking supervision expenses jumping from 77 to 357 million Ghana cedis, almost fivefold. Or your vehicle, in this case here, moving from 61 to 132 million. I think there's more that needs to, they need to provide, and we need to interrogate it. The fundamental point is that there are some operational inefficiencies at the central bank that we need to address. The bigger point that I started off by highlighting or raising is that the operational independence of the central bank, it has not been the case for some time now, and it's something that we need to fix as a country going forward, because you cannot have a debt or even a deficit ceiling and at the end of the day use the back channel of getting the central bank pretty much printing all of the money and financing the government, budget deficit, and that in turn driving part of the inflation that we're seeing. Because you look at the composition of the central bank, Alfred, go to Section 8 of Act 612 as amended, and that where it talks about the board of directors of the central bank. And I will read here and I'll end. It says that the governing body of the Bank of Ghana is the board of directors, and this consists of A, the governor of the bank, who shall be the chair, the first and the deputy governors that are appointed under Section 17, one representative of the Ministry of Finance, not below the rank of a director, 9 other directors, including a chartered accountant, all of whom are appointed by the president in accordance with Article 70 of the Constitution. That is where we need to address the issue going forward. And I think in the IMF program that we've signed, there are some proposals to strengthen the operational independence of the bank. If we don't do that, we'll still end up with this challenge or this issue where the central bank ends up financing most of the government budget.
Dr. Theo Champong, very comprehensive analysis. Then he's still staying with us. And I'll come to you, Mr. Thompson, because you are also not new to the structure of the Bank of Ghana, having been a former deputy managing director of the NIB. Right. The disconnect that George Rickett-Hagan and Dr. Theo Champong have established about the explanation the Bank of Ghana is giving about this 60 billion cedis loss on their books as at the end of 2022 being because the non-marketable holdings of government instruments, including long-term stocks and COVID-19 bonds and overdraft, that's why they lost that much money. Cannot be the explanation for this 60 billion cedis that we're seeing on their books, especially because of what we do know that they have been involved in even financing government business beyond the 5% that we're even talking about.
Thank you once again, and I believe Theo and Ricketts have brought their point in, but it boils down to what Bank of Ghana itself is doing. They are supposed to be in charge of their monetary policy to make sure that inflation doesn't go high and everything. Now, it got to a point where government was finding it difficult to raise bonds because if you remember, the inflation was just skyrocketing from about we're somewhere around 13 or so, and it was just shooting up to over 40%. So around that time, government found it very difficult to raise bonds. So the ones that were falling due, sorry about that, the ones that were falling due, how do we then pay for it? That was when Bank of Ghana had to come in to, settle all those to make sure that at the end of it all, people will not feel that, listen, their monies have been locked up before all these other DDPs started coming in. Also, remember, we had a whole long tussle over the cocoa board bond that they were saying that people, cocoa board and Bank of Ghana could not pay cocoa board and everything. And there was a whole lot of back and forth on it. That, listen, we are going to pay, but we needed to settle the cocoa bills.
I see.
And we are going to
essentially
settle
the Bank of Ghana came to pay
all these things off. Now, in the banking system, you know that, and Ricketts knows very well that the Bank of Ghana itself has their policy by stating that if you have these debts in your book for more than I think 6 months to a year, you have to make provision for it. And in that provision, in your final account, you have to write it off after some time, because once you know that the payment is not going to come, you write it off, and then when it comes in as profit to you. So definitely, the Bank of Ghana cannot keep this in their books as though they are expecting money from government to pay off, especially when they know that within the next few years, these are the rules and the things that they've put in place to make sure that they get money. If they also leave it that, listen, okay, we are the central bank, we have to just watch and make sure that inflation doesn't go up, and it will bounce back at them, and inflation will rather go skyrocketing. So they needed to take a decision on what to do, whether to pay and face the consequences or to leave it and let inflation go high. The dollar will get, CD dollar will go off, and everything will go haywire. They are in charge of monetary policy. They have to also help to make sure that the CD is not depreciated to that extent that we are looking at. So these are all things that came up, and there's not the only country that has experienced some of these things.
With all of that, those interventions account for the 60 billion cedis loss. I think that the fundamental
I
issue
think
here
it
is
came up
that
to 53 point something billion plus
that is
other
the 50% haircut
haircuts that they took. Yeah.
They're over 50 billion. In fact, over 55 billion. I'm saying that would all of that account for that much?
Alfred,
That's the major things. Definitely there will be one or two other things that come in, but that's the major
if I could
project.
I just want to ask you a question. Since he's a banker, I don't understand how this debt exchange would have created such a colossal amount of money. I buy a bond from you, and then I said I'm giving you a 50% haircut.
Yeah.
So your receivables are going to go down.
Yeah.
So basically, you are exposed.
Yeah.
How do I become exposed? Because I am the one going to pay you. So if I'm not going to pay you, that money would then become a credit
To you.
to me. So how can Bank of Ghana claim that it is the debt exchange that has caused them that money? The explanation you were giving about all the things that happened that they had to pay for, it's quite tangible for me to understand that I can see how they got into that problem. Come clean and tell us exactly what is going on. Rather than, look, they've done this before. That is why I'm really taking this out. When they used, what is it called? When there was some 22 billion which they used in financing the central bank, which was questioned, and they came up with all sorts of explanation, including a repo, which is a repurchasing offer.
Yeah.
Again, that explanation was not right. Repurchasing offer is offered by the person who has issued a bond.
Yeah.
So I've issued a bond to you, and I think the bond value is going down, but I think the bond has more value than that. So I want to buy it back from you, just like I'm buying back my shares. I'm the one to pay you.
Yeah.
So how can
Correct.
Bank of Ghana then claim that they got money from repurchasing offer for government? These kind of explanations they are coming up with, and they sound complex, they sound finance, they sound complicated. You're giving me a fantastic explanation
the DDEP
here.
itself started this year. So all these are
even that
records
will not
that
even
are
fit.
previous.
Yeah.
So when you look at the cocoa bond and everything that went through, how the payments came and everything, these are things that affected in their final balance sheet. That is why it's reflecting now.
But you see, I can get the explanation. I don't want these guys to attribute this to this debt exchange because it's not. They are just distorting everything. I would rather hear cocoa bills. I would rather hear all the things you're talking about, which obviously needed to be financed. We have exceeded. We have exceeded the deficit, so no provision was made in terms of borrowing. Yeah. We couldn't go to the capital market.
If you don't pay,
there's not much you can do other than print money, basically. Whether they will say they printed the money or they had it elsewhere, that's a different ball game. But 50, look, do you know that until 2017, we've actually not had losses in the Bank of Ghana since 2017, and then the last one after 2017, the last one is this 2021. 2021, and then now. So 2021 we had
the profit
of about I think
1.2
billion or something.
Yes.
And all of a sudden we have never come across this figure before. But of course, we can talk about COVID, we can talk about everything. Attribute the money to what caused this, so we can actually begin to cure it. For me, it's a money sitting with the government of Ghana, and I believe that the same mechanism. Obviously, there are inflows going to be coming in the future that they can use to offset this amount of money.
But the profit, they have to make provision for it.
The profit that they make, that they distribute with the government, those monies could be kept to clean off this some number of years. Yeah. But to come and tell us that this is one-off, it happens as a result of the COVID, as a result of the DDEF, which in accounting term doesn't even make sense. That if you have the exposure, how does that become a loss for Bank of Ghana? Who is actually saving money I would have paid you? Well, that's my problem.
I know you have issues with some of these things, but they also look at it from their perspective. Sometimes when you are not in there, you would not appreciate and understand some of the things.
We are only going by their response.
Their response, yeah.
And it is their response of the Bank of Ghana to the questions and the queries that all of us have been asking. That's the reference point for this conversation, and that's why they raised a question about they're saying that this loss of 55.12 billion is as a result of DDEP alone.
I'm sure it's about all these. I'm sure it's about all these cocoa, the payment of the government.
This is what they say, and we'll put explanation
and
bring it.
And they answered that last year. So it's just for them to come and say that okay, the DDEP is another project on its own. However, these were things that affected us last year, and that has caused all this. We had to come in and pay. Otherwise, inflation would have gone skyrocket.
Do you actually know that there was an interview by the director of research who was actually saying that he was going as far back as this Malaysian telecom issue, which we had to issue some bond, that they are all accumulation of that.
This.
Like that, you see, that time is far. They would have made provision for it a long time.
Well, they have made profits. They have made profits since then.
Yeah,
and they still have that in their books.
So clearly, all of this, the explanation doesn't wash. But let me bring Professor Godfred Bobking. He's a professor of finance at the University of Ghana. It's a school. Thank you so much, Professor Godfred Bobking, for joining us. So, initially, the Bank of Ghana is saying that this loss, the 60 billion, out of that, the 55.12 billion is as a result of non-marketable holdings of Government of Ghana instruments, including long-term stocks, COVID-19 bond, and overdrafts, which were subject to a 50% haircut. And my guests in studio have established that that cannot be their explanation for this colossal amount of the loss that they have recorded in their books. Do you also see through that?
Analysts and then our listeners and viewers. My considered view, even before the central bank published its annual report or made it public, has been that the domestic debt exchange was going to have a telling on their balance sheets. That was my view. And that hasn't changed even after the publication of the Bank of Ghana annual reports and financial statements. This is where I am coming from. I'm looking at the exposure of the central Bank of Ghana, to Ghana government. And even though somewhere before the first half of last year, there was an issue about the central bank printing cedis to finance the budget deficit. And to some extent, that was denied. But we knew it was just a matter of time and that the whole truth will be made public. We got a first hint of that when the IMF team arrived in Ghana, after, when the president made a call to Washington on the 1st of July. We knew that that was the beginning of a lot more disclosure in terms of what was actually going on at the central bank, because the IMF will bring that to bear. That is what we are seeing. If you look at the level of exposure, you pick the total domestic debt as at the end of 2022. Bank of Ghana's exposure to the central bank alone was 77.6 billion cedis. That was quite high.
77.6 billion.
Yes, that was the total exposure of the central Bank of Ghana to Ghana government, 77.6 billion cedis. Now, if you look at the total domestic debt at that time, at the end of December 2022, we're looking at something around 259 billion cedis. Then the treasury bill component had been excluded. And that was really the only avenue that the government had left to interact with the financial markets. because as one of the panelists said, that we had lost market access. Then again, in the domestic market, in the medium to the long-term end of the market, the government had been priced out. We've lost market access. So the only avenue left to interact with the former financial system was through the money market, treasury bill, largely, 91 day, 182 day. Then the central bank decided to compromise its operational independence, traded off the law in order to sustain the regime, right? Otherwise, the regime would have collapsed. So the effect of Bank of Ghana's posture is what has manifested explicitly in their balance sheet. Now, so if you pick that total, 77.6 billion cedis, and you are looking at the debt sustainability pathway from now to 2028, and you look at the progress that the government had made with the first round of the domestic debt exchange, where government claimed success, but we disputed that. Government claimed that the success rate was 85%. It was simply because the universe of eligible bonds had been adjusted from the original 137 billion cedis to 98 billion cedis. Out of that 98 billion cedis, the government only restructured 85% approximately of the 98 billion cedis. That meant that of the universe of, let's say, 230-something billion cedis, we had only restructured just 83 billion cedis. Even with that one, the coupon rate the government was willing to offer, okay, had to be adjusted. So at the end of the day, with that restructuring, we only ended up by reducing the average coupon rate from 19.1% to about 9.3% when we're done. Now, what that tells you is that the new yield curve that the government was hoping to introduce with the domestic debt exchange could not be enforced. Now, if you look at then, so from there we predicted that the government wasn't done with the domestic debt exchange, because if they had kept to only the 85% of the 98 billion, there was no way Ghana could reach the debt sustainability point by 2028. So we knew that there would be another round of debt restructuring, and our prediction was that they will look at pensions, which at the end of 2022 stood at 29.2 billion cedis. They will also look at the cocoa bill, which stood at, I think, 8.1 billion cedis. They will look at the dollar component of the domestic debt, which stood around $800 million. Then other loans, because if they excluded all of this, there was no way we could achieve their sustainability. The other way to look at it is also look at the level of progress that we can make from external debt restructuring. And external debt here, we are looking at it from two levels: external bilateral, external commercial. External commercial, we are looking at Eurobond. If you look at all these things, you could come to the conclusion that there was no way the government could reach the debt sustainability. Now, because of that, they then decided that they will use the balance sheet of the central bank as the balancing figure.
I see.
This was what eventually happened. So why was that so? They saw the balance sheet of the central bank as a low-hanging fruit. So the difference largely could be loaded on the balance sheet of the central bank. And that is what raises also an issue. And I'll tell you why. If you look at the IMF-supported program, even though it was the IMF that was advising Ghana government to restructure our debt, the total external debt, as at the end of 2022, stood at $30.5 billion. Out of this $30.5 billion, $8.8 billion of that related to multilateral debt. Now, then the IMF said that, consistent with best practices, best known to them also, that the IMF, the World Bank, and other multilateral institutions consider themselves as the lenders of last resort. And therefore, as lenders of last resort, they will not allow their balance sheet to be impaired by the debt restructuring. And therefore, the multilateral debt of $8.8 billion had to be excluded. Now, when it came to the side of Bank of Ghana, then this same principle didn't apply, because the Bank of Ghana is also a lender of last resort in our economy.
True.
But now we've loaded that haircut on the central bank balance sheet, and that is what I believe largely. If you put the cocoa bill and all of the other bills, marketable, non-marketable, and then you look at the haircut, and bear in mind that in the case of Bank of Ghana, they took a deeper haircut.
Sorry. Apologies. Professor Bobking's connection just truncated. We'll try and reconnect with him. But a very, very important point about the offloading. You see, that's what's happened now, Mr. Kethagen. And the offloading of government loss, the burden of this DDEP onto the balance sheet of the Bank of Ghana. Now, the question is now, they are saying that they can't be held responsible for what's happened because, look, this is government, they invested in government papers and instruments. So if there's any question to be asked, it's to the DDEP. Who has to be held responsible for what's happened? Now.
Yeah, I do agree with most of the things Professor Bobkin, said. The only point that I disagree with him is to do with the exposure level. Exposure and losses are two different things. You can be exposed to something, it doesn't necessarily mean that will be your loss. You can be exposed to $100 and lose 20. So there are two different things. What we are talking about, 60 billion, is not exposure. These are realized losses. Losses that has been realized by the bank. And I do agree, again, I go back to what Alfred was saying earlier on. I do agree with the explanation. I wish they get you at the Bank of Ghana to explain some of this. All the explanations that is made, and simply it comes down to the point that they had to, I always call it print money. They have to finance government. And the reason I call it print money is that all the other monies that Bank of Ghana receives is actually for the government of Ghana.
Yeah.
Every money that Bank of Ghana receives is for the government of Ghana. So Bank of Ghana, through small activities that they do, like some of the things I mentioned to you, some investment offshore and all that, printing of money, that they make some money out of it. They also have their huge operational, like Dr. Tio was talking about, to do with all these traveling bills and vehicles and all that. So when it comes to this huge amount of money, which is basically Bank of Ghana financing, who did they finance? They financed the government of Ghana. Therefore, ideally, if government of Ghana had gone to any other bank to get that money, it would be sitting in their books as their debt. So Bank of Ghana should pass this responsibility. But you see, it's neither here nor there. Whether Bank of Ghana pass the responsibility to the government of Ghana or not, it is the Bank of Ghana that will have to help the government of Ghana to basically get back the money.
So it's still Bank of Ghana.
So it's still Bank of Ghana. But
it's their responsibility.
In terms of debt treatment, if we are to go strictly by debt treatment, then this debt should have been added to the national debt.
This 60 billion?
Yes.
Should have been added to the national debt.
That will prevent Bank of Ghana to continue, financing government operations if government is going to have it as a debt in its books. So for me, the debt is neither here nor there, but it is the government of Ghana's debt, which Bank of Ghana is a custodian, and the Bank of Ghana, as they have done in the past, will have to help the government of Ghana in terms of all that they receive. And as I said, most of the monies that they receive, Eurobond, all the other monies, export revenue and all that, these are all government of Ghana's money that they keep in custody for the government. If government is drawing down on any money from Bank of Ghana, is drawing down from any money from Bank of Ghana, it will be drawing down its own money that Bank of Ghana is holding. It is when that money is finished, and this is technically, doesn't work exactly like that. It is when that money is finished that then the Bank of Ghana will be authorized by that the government of Ghana will authorize the Bank of Ghana to go out there and do either a domestic bond, or if the capital markets are open to us, they will go and do external bond to basically finance the deficit. It is when all these are consumed, as they did quite recently, is when the Bank of Ghana, when it started, that's also another big problem. The Bank of Ghana started doing the work of the fiscal authorities. As in the things that the Ministry of Finance should be doing in terms of basically putting the economy back on track is what Bank of Ghana was
inflation targeting.
Inflation is a very good example, because at the time when we had that inflation, the inflation was coming from three different areas. One of them was a supply side inflation, which they will attribute to the COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war. So those are supply side. And then we have a demand side inflation, which usually comes from demand, production and all that, wages is going up and all that. The third one is coming from this Bank of Ghana financing, which Dr. Theo said was inflationary. So the Bank of Ghana, being the authority responsible for targeting inflation, thought that it is its job to control inflation. Therefore, the area that fiscal policy should address the supply side issue, they were using monetary policy to fight, as well as doing that for demand, as well as doing that for the problem they themselves have created in terms of printing more money and putting it in the system. So this is the problem that caused the Bank of Ghana.
I'll bring Martin Kpebu, but let me go back to Professor Bokking was making a point and then I lost you. But Professor Bokking, if you look at the law that the Bank of Ghana is actually governed by, and the consistent violation of it, as has been referenced on this platform, it raises questions about the kind of punishment that some commercial banks had to be dealt with by the Bank of Ghana for violating the same laws that the Bank of Ghana itself is also violating. So, for instance, in issues of corporate governance, the Bank of Ghana's non-adherence to the 5% limit of the 2016, there's Amendment Act 2016-918, had led to this loss that we're dealing with right now. If you look at the non-performing loans that some banks and other financial institutions were closed down for, the Bank of Ghana is committing the same sin. Credit risk, you can see that as well there. And some form of related party lending in there as well. Really, so you see that the Bank of Ghana is committing the same sin that other commercial banks were punished by them for. Is it not? If you can unmute for me.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Yeah, that is an important intervention. And actually, in any way, I've said it on one of the other platforms that in any serious society, I believe that maybe the governor would advise himself and resign. Right?
The governor would have resigned by now.
I mean, even though they found themselves in a very difficult situation, I think the central bank intentionally compromised its independence, sold its birthright to the government in the first place. And it's not only, as you rightly said, it's not only this administration. Actually, since we started inflation targeting unofficially from March 2002 and officially from 2007, you realize that one of the big problems why it's been difficult to tame inflation and engineer growth has been fiscal indiscipline. So because one important requirement for inflation targeting to be effective is fiscal discipline. Since March 2022 to date, we have not been able to guarantee fiscal discipline, which will make monetary policy effective in bringing down inflation and engineer job-rich growth. So the 16th IMF-supported program from April 3, 2015 to April 2019, one of the program objectives was to eliminate the fiscal dominance of monetary policy. Now, and the most effective instrument that the IMF thought that would help to eliminate the fiscal dominance of monetary policy was zero financing of the budget. So at that time, the law empowers the central bank to finance the deficit to the tune of 10% of government's previous year's total revenue. So we had to suspend our own act and comply with an MOU with the IMF. Now, in the wisdom of Parliament, that our central bank is not just for policy formulation and regulation. Our central bank also takes on a certain developmental perspective. And therefore, for sustainability, we cannot do without a certain level of financing from the central bank. So in the wisdom of Parliament, they revised the Bank of Ghana Act and pegged the deficit financing at 5%. Now, what have we seen? And as we have seen over the years, this has been observed more in breach than in compliance. It's also, then again, you see the sanctioning regime is very weak, okay? And therefore, it's been very difficult for the central bank to maintain its operational independence. So what this should tell all of us, and I'm saying that you will see difference in terms of the magnitude now, but it's pervasive across the period. This should help us to begin a national conversation about how we can insulate the central bank from political cannibalizing, right? Political capture, okay? We need to find a way of preserving those national institutions so that our politics does not, because the way it is now, we've practically destroyed the central bank, okay? We have incapacitated the central bank in taking up certain key interventions when they become necessary. And ultimately, we are undermining confidence in our financial system. Remember, the central bank could be policy solvent, but that doesn't restore total confidence in our system. It doesn't restore total confidence in terms of correspondent banking. Look, even if you look at what has happened to the banks, many of them have had to revise their line of credit and in terms of correspondent banking with the outside world. Okay, so remember that when people are transacting with the country, big ticket transactions and all of that, they are looking at so many factors. And I think this is just not good. We failed to protect the balance sheet of the central bank, but largely also because the central bank sold its birthright in the first place.
Central bank sold this birthright. And people bring you in at this point, essentially because this also borders on law. And consistently, there's been a violation of this particular law by the Bank of Ghana. And Professor Bobke pointed out quite clearly, the birthright has been sold. And this has resulted in what we're dealing with right now. Lawyer.
Yes, so as Prof rightly mentioned, I'm going to the Bank of Ghana Act, the Act 612, as amended by the 918. He's already referred to the fact that there's a 5% cap. Yes, so it says that that's okay, I'm going to read it out.
Once he does that,
Okay.
can I come in briefly?
Okay, what do you want to say? Go ahead. The principal, Section 30, let me just make it.
Okay.
Section 30 of Act 612 amended says that the total loans, advances, purchases of treasury bills and securities made under subsection 1 shall not at any time exceed 5% of the total revenue of the previous fiscal year. You say it. Yes, the total loans, advances, purchases of treasury bills, and securities made under subsection 1 shall not at any time exceed 5% of the total revenue of the previous fiscal year. So that's the cap that the law talks about, that government should not receive more than 5% of the fiscal revenue. Yeah, raised the previous year from the central bank. In other words, the central bank shouldn't give more than the 5%. Yes, and we know if you look at the Fiscal Responsibility Act, we are able to suspend it in periods of like when the COVID came, right? But last year wasn't COVID. You see, so and such a colossal, and when you say 5%, you didn't just exceed 5%, multiple, because last year they got what, 45 billion Ghana cedis, and in 2021 they printed how much more? 35 billion. This way, Prof is still online. You can corroborate, because from the records I've seen in 2021 they took what, 35 billion. Then in 2022, 45. You see, like such impunity, thinking that we can't read or we are just fools. I mean, Governor Addison has to just go. It's just too much. Such impunity. It's too much. It's too much. The law says don't exceed by, don't take deficit financing more than 5%. But you have gone triple. Look, and it's not the total of the budget. It's the revenue we raised. So let's go in 2022. As far as I'm aware, what we raised, we didn't raise more than 75 billion. We didn't raise more than that. If we look in the budget, yes, we didn't raise more than 75 billion. And so if we didn't raise more than 75 billion, and yet the previous year was even less, so how do you give, 45 billion in 2022? Then in 2021 you gave 35. It's too much. It's too much. I think the law must bite.
When the 5% should have been about three.
So that's why the law is put in there to check these situations, and then the law is violated. There's actually no punishment for the violation of the law, so it continues.
Right, there's about two years. I think there's some imprisonment too. 2 years.
But then who has to then also take action?
Yeah.
If there's provision for punitive action, who has to take that action in an instance like this so that it doesn't repeat itself?
So we should be reporting. He's coming in.
Alfred, we can look at both sides. The Bank of Ghana can sit down aloof and say that, listen, government, you have an issue, deal with your issue, I'm not going to come in, and the whole nation will suffer for it. They are in charge of monetary policy. Government is in charge of fiscal policy. Both work hand in hand to make sure that the nation survives. Now, are we going to say that...
But there's a reason why the law
there is a reason why
the 5%.
Yes,
and the conditions as stipulated in the law that particular provision can be violated and it will be allowable. The instances we've seen, does it fall within the conditions that the law allows the Bank of Ghana to go beyond the 5%?
Bank of Ghana came in for a reason, because they also were looking at a situation where our monetary policy will not go haywire. They are supposed to control and make sure that our inflation doesn't go overboard, CD valuation doesn't go overboard, policies that will make the nation survive are intact. Do we sit down aloof and look at it and say that, okay, because there's a critical situation now, as a governor, and we are going to sit down and watch what the government can do? You have to step in. You have to come in, because you also have a board, or you have a situation to cover.
Extent.
And you go. That is why you have to sometimes go for parliamentary approval for certain things. These are the questions you have. Okay, did we go for parliamentary approval? These are one or two questions you can answer. But the truth is that they needed at a point in time to make sure that the nation doesn't suffer.
Well, you have asked a question about
the nation doesn't
approval.
suffer.
Did this come to Parliament?
It didn't. And then when we challenged this on several occasions, they actually denied it. This is where repos and all those issues came in. That they weren't actually Bank of Ghana financing, but they are monies that is due the government itself through
that
repos
it to them.
And all that they give it to them, which was true.
So you want to say that they are lying?
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
I don't think they will lie
But
over
you have
such
just
things. Because
asked the
definitely,
question
I asked the
that
question that
they should have gone to
I
Parliament
said,
for approval.
if this they gets to an extent that listen, you have to go beyond the 5%, you can go for parliamentary approval.
Yes.
That listen, this is a
But
critical
and
situation.
then the former Deputy Finance Minister, who is a current MP in this 8th Parliament, is saying that they didn't come to Parliament for approval.
And
you are saying
not
it's lying.
only-
On which
only
one?
did
He
they
is
not
talking
come to
about a
Parliament.
different issue altogether. That's the repos and things. He doesn't believe
Okay.
them. And I'm saying that
Right.
if you
All
don't
right,
believe
gentlemen.
them, you
And
say
on
you
the
don't
reports
believe
I'm
them.
talking
Okay.
about. I'm talking
But-
about the explanation that they gave for money that they were basically financing from the central bank, making it look like we didn't know what we were talking about, but it wasn't central bank financing. In the end,
I
it has
believe,
ended up to
in
be
due
central
course,
bank
the
finance.
governor and the team will come out with all the necessary
Well, they have
breakdown
held
and
a press
explanations.
conference this
But
week.
to tell you the truth,
and this is it.
instead of making the country go haywire with all these things,
When you say
it's
these
better
things, I have a
to
problem with it. It's like saying that,
Okay.
excuse me, somebody goes and steal food to eat, and he says that I did so because I was hungry, and everybody says that, oh, that's fine. Since he was angry,
there are two different
he was
issues.
hungry.
There are two different
Yeah,
issues.
that's what we are saying.
But you
that
know
if he
that
hadn't
they are
done
in charge
that,
of
All right, we
monetary
need to
policy.
round this up.
They're
They're in
And
charge
I'm
of
going to-
monetary policy. What do they have to do?
The next issue.
They have to put in
Reckless
place things
expenditure.
that will make sure
Frivolous
No, it is
expenditure.
not
That got us to
it's
where
not
we are.
reckless expenditure.
Well,
That's what brought
Bank
all
of
Oh, yeah,
this.
the
the
IMF
evidence
said
is-
it's
That's
off
what it
budget.
is.
It's in the IMF report. We just did
The
that.
evidence
expenditure.
is
Off
there.
budget
All right,
spending. And
so
Professor
that's
Chira
corruption.
referred-
Yes,
That is what
referred-
has brought us
Listen,
to where we are.
budget
listen,
spending.
The finance
Bank
minister
of
is saying
England,
that
they say that
the-
they